The light is blinding. It slices through the darkness of the room, stark and clinical, a violence against the plush, suburban comfort of the king-sized bed. Sarah Garcia is 18 now, but at this moment, she is 16 again, and she can't move. She is trapped in the cotton-soft prison of a deep, drug-induced sleep. Two figures lean over her. Not shadows, but real people. Richard and Patricia Thomas. They look like the picture of respectable affluence, but their faces are devoid of any warmth. Their movements are practiced, mechanical. This isn't your regular nightmare. This is a procedure. Richard is holding a syringe. He gently, expertly, slides the needle into the soft skin of her inner elbow. A slow, steady pull. A dark, vital crimson fills the tube. Patricia is at her face, carefully, clinically, taking a swab from the inside of her cheek. They are measuring her, documenting her, taking from her. Not secrets, not innocence. It's something you'd never expect. This home, this family, this perfectly manicured existence was all a beautifully constructed cage. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a resource. What you are about to hear is the story of how a little girl, labeled by the system as troubled, uncovered a global operation so dark, so calculating, it makes the traditional monsters of true crime look like amateurs. They were selling her, piece by piece, and the people who helped them do it were the very ones sworn to protect her. She was one of 200 children harvested by a network of predators in plain sight. But by the time she knew the truth, a part of her was already gone. But that was just the beginning. The worst betrayal was yet to come. To understand the horror of that first night, you have to understand Sarah Garcia and the life she had already survived. She was born in the summer of 2003, and by the age of 8, her world had already shattered. Her mother, a woman who loved her but was lost to a crushing addiction, died of an overdose. Suddenly Sarah became a ward of the state, swallowed by the foster care system. It was a cycle of endless transition, 12 homes in 8 years, new schools, new faces, new rules, and always the same crushing label, difficult and troubled. She acted out because she had learned the hard way that no one ever stayed, and no home was ever safe. Every time she got too close to a new set of parents, they would find an excuse to send her back. It was easier to push them away first. Sarah developed a deep-seated suspicion of all kindness, but beneath that defensive shell, all she ever truly wanted was what the Thomas application promised, a forever home, a place to finally unpack her single worn duffel bag and believe that this time she was chosen, she was wanted. In March of 2019, at 16 years old, she was placed with Richard and Patricia Thomas in a sprawling suburb of Connecticut. The Thomases were the picture of stability, a pattern interrupt from the chaos of Sarah's past. Richard, in his late 40s, was a successful pharmaceutical consultant. Patricia, a few years younger, volunteered at the local animal shelter and had that soft, unhurried demeanor Sarah desperately longed for in a mother figure. They had no children of their own, and their application to foster had sailed through the necessary checks. Their home was immaculate, filled with sun and expensive, non-child-proof furniture. They told Sarah she was special. They told her they had specifically chosen her file out of dozens. "We saw something in you, Sarah," Patricia had said, a gentle hand on her shoulder, "a strength that we admire. This is your home now." Sarah tried not to believe it, but a fragile hope, a dangerous, reckless kind of hope, began to bloom inside her. She found herself relaxing. The house felt quiet, safe. But looking back, the subtle signs, the foreshadowing, were already there, hidden in plain sight.
She remembered the pristine white towels in the guest bathroom, all perfectly folded, a detail so innocent, but now haunting. They weren't white. They were a faint, barely perceptible shade of lilac. She also recalled a conversation in the car on the way from the agency. Richard had asked, in a tone that sounded casual, about her blood type, mentioning a new study he was working on. Sarah simply replied, "O negative." At the time, she didn't think twice about the question. He was in pharmaceuticals, after all. It was these tiny, clinical details, a purple towel, a casually asked question, that would later gain the most twisted meaning. The day Sarah stepped across the threshold of the Thomas home was the point of no return. The day was March 23rd, 2019. She spent the afternoon settling into a room that felt too grand for her modest belongings. At dinner, they laughed easily. They didn't interrogate her about her past. They simply talked about the future. Just after 9 p.m., Patricia came to her door. She held a warm ceramic mug. "It's a little bedtime ritual we have," Patricia explained. "Warm milk, a dash of nutmeg, helps you sleep soundly on your first night here." Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. No one had ever done anything so simple, so thoughtful for her. She took the mug, nodded her thanks, and watched Patricia's kind, motherly smile. She drank the milk. It tasted faintly sweet, a little metallic on the finish. She brushed her teeth, changed into the oversized t-shirt and gym shorts she wore for bed, and climbed under the heavy, soft comforter. The sleep that followed was immediate and total. It wasn't a restful sleep. It was a shutdown, a forced cessation of consciousness. The next morning, Sarah awoke with a sense of unease. Her head felt heavy, cottony. The metallic taste lingered on her tongue. It was the kind of feeling you get after a bad dental procedure. She threw off the covers and immediately noticed the faint dark bruise on her left arm, a small, circular mark the size of a pinprick. She was certain it hadn't been there when she went to bed. Then she looked down at her clothes. She hadn't slept in the oversized t-shirt and gym shorts. She was wearing a perfectly clean, brand-new set of lilac-colored pajamas. Lilac, like the towels. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the pinpricked bruise, at the strange clothes, at the overwhelming normalcy of the room. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was being paranoid, that years of being in and out of clinics for checkups had made her jumpy. She put the t-shirt and shorts back on and walked to breakfast, unconsciously stepping into a danger more systematic and terrifying than any foster kid could ever imagine. What would you have done? The incident on the first night became an unsettling pattern, a rhythmic violation that chipped away at Sarah's fragile sense of safety. Every few nights, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 days apart, Patricia Thomas would arrive with the ceramic mug of warm milk. A little bedtime ritual, she'd say, delivered with that practiced, gentle smile. Sarah tried to refuse once. "I'm not really hungry, Mrs. Thomas," she recalled saying. Patricia's smile didn't waver, but her voice hardened just enough to send a cold spike of fear through Sarah. "Nonsense, dear. It's for good rest. You'll thank me in the morning." Sarah drank it. The metallic aftertaste was always the same, followed by the immediate, paralyzing drowsiness. The evidence was accumulating. A bruise on her ankle one week, a persistent, deep fatigue the next. The worst part was the missing time. She couldn't account for the hours between falling into that unnatural sleep and the groggy, uneasy awakening. Her clothes were always different, and they were always the same, those new, lilac-colored cotton pajamas. For the first 4 weeks, Sarah told herself it was her trauma. She was difficult, remember? A girl labeled troubled, who saw danger everywhere. She made up excuses. She rolled over hard in the night. The milk was just rich. She had finally found a home, and her subconscious was fighting it. But the logic of her internal monologue was crumbling fast. She needed proof. She needed to know what happened during those lost, stolen hours. What happens when the person you trusted most is the person actively taking from you? The answer came on the night of April 28th. Sarah had been planning for days. She retrieved an old, cracked smartphone she'd managed to keep hidden through all the group homes. She found an app that activated the camera based on motion. She needed to hide it perfectly, using a micro-detail accumulation of her own to counter theirs. She carefully positioned a stack of paperback novels on her bedside table, obscuring the phone completely, leaving only the tiniest sliver of the camera lens visible, aimed directly at the foot of her bed. It was a risky move, but the need to confirm her sanity had become more pressing than the fear of being caught. That night, Patricia arrived with the warm milk. Same smile, same mug, same taste. Sarah drank it down, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She closed her eyes and waited for the darkness to take her.
The next morning, she woke with a dull headache and a fresh pinprick on the back of her hand. She grabbed the phone, her hands trembling. Her internal monologue was a chaotic mess. Please be nothing. Please just be me acting out. I want this to be my home. She played the video. For hours, nothing. Just the deep, muffled silence of the Connecticut night. Then, the timestamp on the screen rolled to 2:07 a.m. The door handle turned slowly. Richard and Patricia Thomas walked in. They were wearing not their usual soft cotton robes, but crisp, white, disposable medical gowns. They were not alone. There were two other people, a middle-aged, silver-haired couple Sarah didn't recognize, also in gowns. The Thomases moved to her bed. The movements were not predatory or sexual. They were frighteningly clinical. Richard placed a metal tray on the nightstand. Patricia gently moved Sarah's arm, exposing the inner elbow. Richard then did it. He drew blood using a thin, professional-grade syringe and carefully labeled vials. The process was silent, efficient, and horrifyingly mundane. The silver-haired woman watched, taking specific photos, focusing on Sarah's unconscious face and the labeled vials. This wasn't roughhousing, or a drunken mistake, or anything Sarah could rationalize away with her past abuse. This was organized. This was a procedure. This was a major revelation. Sarah rewound the video countless times, focusing on the two outsiders. Their interest wasn't lust. It was possession. They looked like investors inspecting a valuable commodity. She realized what was happening, and the realization was a different kind of violation entirely. The horror wasn't what was expected, sexual abuse, but the complete commodification of her body. They weren't molesting her. They were harvesting her. The truth recontextualized everything. The warm milk wasn't a ritual. It was a sedative. The frequent doctor's checkups the Thomases insisted upon weren't parental concern. They were baseline health assessments. The interest in her blood type was specific and urgent. She remembered the lilac pajamas. She realized she was likely being changed into those gowns while they worked, and the lilac pajamas were a sterile uniform. The risk escalated immediately. Sarah knew she couldn't stay. She deleted the video from the old phone and hid it, then made a conscious decision to act as if nothing had changed. She had to play the role of the docile, grateful foster child.
Her chance came the following afternoon. Richard Thomas was known to spend hours in his home office, which he kept locked. He told Sarah it contained sensitive documents related to his pharmaceutical work. She saw the lock type, an old wafer tumbler, and realized she'd seen a simple key set in a drawer in the kitchen. While Richard was out for a consultation, Sarah used the key. The office was dominated by a large mahogany desk. Behind a hidden panel, she discovered files, dozens of them. They weren't pharmaceutical. They were medical records. The files were meticulously organized. They were not just Sarah's. There were folders with photos and case notes on at least 40 other children, all around Sarah's age, all placed with the Thomases over the last 15 years. The names were from different states: Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. The documents weren't about foster care or abuse reports. They were biological profiles. They detailed blood types, tissue compatibility scores, genetic markers, and complex HLA typing. Beneath each profile was a price tag. Sarah saw notes in Richard's handwriting. $450K for O-neg bone marrow match. High-risk client, urgent tissue typing needed. The full, shocking truth slammed into her. The Thomases weren't pedophiles. They were biological facilitators. They were running a sophisticated operation, treating the vulnerable foster children who passed through their perfectly respectable home as a living, breathing genetic inventory. They were selling samples, blood, swabs, maybe even more evil things, to wealthy clients desperate for compatible tissue and organs. And the system itself had handed them the supply. Sarah frantically photographed every document with the hidden phone, her perspective shifting violently. She thought she was running from an abuser. She was running from a clinic. She thought she was an unwanted kid. She was a prized genetic commodity. She had to escape, now. She put the files back exactly as she found them and raced to her room. She pulled out the old phone, her insurance, her evidence. She knew she couldn't trust a social worker. She couldn't trust the system that labeled her and then sold her. She needed to go directly to someone outside the chain of authority. She was going to the police. But what happens when the police look at the files and the primary suspect is the one who chooses which children they investigate? The scope of the danger was about to expand far beyond this perfect suburban home, revealing a network that had already swallowed 200 children and was still hungry for more.
Sarah Garcia made the decision to run. It was May 1st, 2019. Under the cover of a simulated power outage, she'd unscrewed fuse in the garage. She slipped out the back door and ran for the nearest major street. Her worn duffel bag was light, containing only a few changes of clothes, a granola bar, and the old smartphone that held the sickening evidence. She didn't run to the local police. She ran to the state capitol and found the nearest FBI field office. She told her story, showed them the time-stamped video of the clinical violation, and presented the photographic evidence of the 40 medical files she'd found. For a child labeled troubled, her testimony was sharp, precise, and utterly terrifying. The FBI immediately initiated a raid on the Thomas home. The Thomases were arrested without incident. The initial media blackout was total. The case seemed closed. Two sick, wealthy people exploiting a vulnerable child for profit. Layer 1, the surface layer of the story, was resolved. But the investigators were about to peel back to Layer 2. The agents swarmed the pristine Connecticut house, and what they found confirmed Sarah's claims, but made the situation much bigger. Hidden in a false wall in the basement was a refrigerated storage unit. Inside, hundreds of vials of blood, tissue, and bone marrow samples, all meticulously categorized with numeric codes and genetic markers. This wasn't a small-time operation. It was a professional, high-volume biological facility disguised as a family home. The community voice began to surface as neighbors started speaking to the authorities, their words filled with retroactive dread. Neighbors whispered about the strange delivery vans that came in the middle of the night, one detective later reported. They all knew the Thomases fostered children, but no one ever saw the kids stay long. Locals knew them as pillars of the community, always donating to the library fund. No one saw the danger because the Thomases presented such a flawless public face. The investigation quickly confirmed that the samples weren't just from the 40 files Sarah photographed. The inventory showed matches for over 200 different individuals. This wasn't just about Sarah. This was an industrial-scale exploitation of children running for over a decade, and the scope was international, with documented shipments tracked to private medical facilities in places like Singapore and Dubai. The quiet suburb of Connecticut was merely the hub of a global market built on stolen biological material.
The sheer volume of victims meant a clear pattern had to exist. Richard Thomas, a pharmaceutical consultant, certainly had the knowledge of genetic markers, but he didn't have access to the system that funneled the children directly to him. The investigators started cross-referencing the 200 victim files found in the basement with records from the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. It took days of painstaking forensic accounting, but the results were chilling. Every single child who had been successfully harvested by the Thomases over the past 15 years shared two critical characteristics. They were categorized as difficult or high-risk placements, and they had been placed through the same small network of caseworkers. The pattern was clear. The children selected were those who the system had already failed, the ones who had a history of running away, those who had already been in 10-plus homes. Kids no one would miss. They were chosen not just for their vulnerability, but for their genetic excellence. Many of the victims had extremely rare blood types, like Sarah's O-negative, or specific, highly valuable tissue matches needed for specialized and expensive private sector medical procedures. This wasn't random selection. This was calculated precision. Remember that seemingly innocent question Richard asked in the car about Sarah's blood type? The investigators discovered that for every victim, Richard or Patricia had initiated a similar, seemingly casual query about their health history or genetic background before the placement was finalized. The Thomases were vetting their product before delivery. With the scale of the crime established, the investigation deepened, shifting focus from the Thomases' home to their digital and financial life. The FBI's Digital Forensics Unit pulled apart every layer of Richard Thomas's computer. They discovered encrypted communications using a dark web portal, detailing the transactions. The forensic-level specificity was damning. They found exact timestamps for procedures. Sample 447B, O-neg, harvested 2:14 a.m. 04/29/19, prepared for transit. That date was the night after Sarah ran her camera. The samples were being shipped within hours of collection. Financial records revealed the true scale of the profit. Over the past 5 years alone, the Thomases had moved over $50 million through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. This was not a side hustle. This was their primary business.
But the critical breakthrough came from Patricia Thomas's work computer, which she had been using for both her job and the harvesting operation. Court documents revealed her user logs showed an alarming pattern. She was accessing the Connecticut Department of Children and Families database outside of work hours, specifically running filters on children based on medical history, placement risk, and age. It was here that the investigators uncovered Layer 3, the darker reality beneath. Patricia Thomas wasn't just a foster parent. She was a Department of Children and Families social worker. She was the gatekeeper. She was the one who controlled placements. She selected the kids, she approved her husband's home, and she steered the most genetically valuable children, the ones no one would look for, directly into their hands. Think about that for a moment. The system that was meant to be the last line of defense was in fact the recruitment network. The discovery that Patricia was a social worker changed the entire dynamic. The personal toll on Sarah was immense, compounding her initial trauma. The person who had offered her a home
was actively selling her biological material while promising her a forever home. Investigators understood that if one social worker was this deeply embedded and this calculating, she couldn't be working in isolation. They ran Patricia Thomas's contact list against the financial transactions and the encrypted communication logs. They discovered that Richard and Patricia were merely a cell within a vast, organized network. The danger was ongoing. The network wasn't just in Connecticut. It included medical facilitators and recruiters in 6 different states, all targeting children in the foster system, all looking for specific genetic profiles. They realized that by exposing the Thomases, they hadn't stopped the operation. They had merely activated its countermeasures. The other facilitators were already dissolving their front companies and moving their inventory. The investigation had gone from a horrific local crime to a massive systemic collapse of institutional trust, one that had cost over 200 children their biological autonomy, some of whom had already disappeared entirely, traced to illegal organ transplant operations overseas. The rhetorical what-if question hung heavy in the air. What happens when the person you trusted most to shepherd you to safety is the one who puts a price tag on your very existence? The scope of the true betrayal was now agonizingly clear.
The arrest of the Thomases was not the end of the story. It was merely the inciting incident for an expansive criminal enterprise. Investigators were no longer looking for 2 criminals. They were hunting a system. Digital forensics analysts worked around the clock, mapping the nodes of Patricia Thomas's encrypted communication logs. What they uncovered was horrifyingly precise. The network revealed. This was Layer 3, the core reality. A multi-state operation they dubbed the Shepherds. The irony was nauseating. The people meant to guide the lost children were the ones leading them to the slaughter. The network included not just medical facilitators like the Thomases, but also recruiters, other social workers and case managers in 6 different states: Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Illinois. They were all coordinating. They were all paid handsomely. Patricia Thomas's role was to be the proof of concept, the central hub of the operation for the East Coast, perfecting the method of selecting high-risk children with valuable genetic profiles. The financial scale was colossal. Richard Thomas's encrypted files detailed international transactions totaling nearly $150 million over 10 years. The buyers were not medical charities. They were private elite medical groups in Dubai, Switzerland, and Singapore, catering exclusively to the world's ultra-wealthy. They paid exorbitant sums, often 7 figures per genetic match, for guaranteed, untraceable tissue and organ material. These were the only kind of clients who could afford to literally buy a biological match to save their loved ones. The tension was excruciating for the FBI. Time was the enemy. Every hour they spent mapping the network, another facilitator was destroying evidence. Another vulnerable child was at risk. They had identified at least a dozen other ongoing placements. Children currently sleeping in homes just like the Thomases, being systematically harvested. The scope of the operation had moved beyond genetic samples. They had confirmation that at least a dozen children had disappeared entirely after aging out of the system, their rare tissues likely used for full organ transplants overseas. The pressure mounted. They had the names and locations of key recruiters, but they needed to catch them in the act to prove the conspiracy, not just the isolated act of theft.
The breakthrough arrived on September 12, 2019. FBI analysts were monitoring a high-value transaction flagged in Richard Thomas's accounts, a payment scheduled for the transfer of a rare pediatric bone marrow sample to a private clinic in Singapore. The transaction was said to go through a shell company in upstate New York, run by one of Patricia's contacts, a social worker named Esther Roy. Esther was a coordinator, not a facilitator. She had a network of drivers who transported the samples. The specific date and time for the final handoff before international transit was exactly 7:43 p.m. that evening at a quiet, unmarked warehouse in Queens, New York. This was their opportunity. This was the chance to intercept the evidence, confirm the buyer, and collapse the larger operation. The FBI immediately moved to execute a simultaneous multi-state sweep. Sarah Garcia, now under federal protection, provided a crucial piece of information. She remembered seeing a specific brand of purple flip-flops in a photo of a previous foster child's Noom in the Thomas files, a child named Leo. She told agents that Patricia Thomas had given her a pair of those same flip-flops. Investigators realized these weren't just innocuous details, they were markers. They were a gift package given to every high-value child, a small, subtle signal that they were the latest inventory. This callback and payoff focused the agents. They knew they weren't just tracking packages, they were tracking children. The purple flip-flops became an unofficial, morbid symbol of the network's victims. The raid was set for 7:40 p.m. The clock ticked down to the moment of truth. Outside the Queens warehouse, a full tactical team assembled. Inside, Esther Roy was meeting with 2 couriers. On the table between them was a temperature-controlled container. At 7:43 p.m., the warehouse door did not burst open. The FBI, learning from the network's hyper-efficiency, chose a different route. Agents, disguised as delivery personnel, approached the side door. Sensory immersion was critical in those final moments. The air was thick with the smell of old concrete and dust. A faint humming sound emanated from the warehouse, the sound of the refrigeration unit keeping the stolen biological material viable. The moment the side door opened, the agents moved. Esther Roy screams. The couriers scramble. They try to grab the container, but the agents are faster. The struggle is brief, brutal, and utterly silent, save for the panicked shouts of the arrestees.
Esther was apprehended. The container was secured. The evidence was irrefutable. Inside the box, labeled with 2 distinct numeric codes, were vials of blood and bone marrow. The corresponding paperwork confirmed the source: a 17-year-old girl named Madison in the Illinois foster system, and an 18-year-old boy who had recently aged out of care. They were the product. Esther was the logistical facilitator. The multi-state sweep was a success. 6 other foster homes were raided simultaneously across the Northeast and Midwest. 11 children were removed from immediate danger. The network had been broken. The primary resolution was achieved. The arrests were made, and the evidence was secured. With the network dismantled and the evidence secured, the focus shifted to Patricia Thomas. During her interrogation, the quiet facade finally cracked. The full scope of the psychology behind the crimes emerged. The prosecutor later summarized her motivation. It was never about hate, it was about efficiency. Patricia, the social worker, didn't view her victims as children. She saw them as an overlooked resource. She used the confession format in her statement. She told detectives she became disillusioned with the system. She felt foster care was a waste of resources. The children, in her words, were already damaged goods. By connecting their valuable genetics to those who needed it most, the rich who could afford to pay, she believed she was creating a market efficiency, moving assets from the unwanted to the necessary. It was a staggering justification. She believed she was a morbid kind of altruist, leveraging a broken public system for a ruthless private gain. She confirmed that she had personally selected all 200 children, using the DCF database to find the perfect mix of high-risk case files and valuable genetics. The truth was laid bare. The Thomases were not the lone wolves of true crime. They were the product of a flawed system, willing to exploit the vulnerability they were paid to protect. Their actions were calculated, long-running, and focused on maximum profit, treating human life as a fungible commodity. The primary resolution was achieved. The Thomases and their immediate ring of recruiters were in custody,
But the case against the buyers, the elite clinics and wealthy families who paid for the stolen tissue, was just beginning. The arrest of Richard and Patricia Thomas, along with the other recruiters and facilitators across 6 states, led to a sprawling, landmark federal case. In the end, there was a measure of justice. The Thomases were convicted of multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and biological trafficking. They received consecutive life sentences. Esther Roy and the other social workers faced decades in prison, stripped of their licenses and their systemic power. The most profound outcome, however, was not the prison sentences, but the voices of the victims finally being heard. Sarah Garcia's story became the catalyst for a national reckoning. The FBI investigation successfully identified 200 children who had been harvested by the Shepherd's Network over the preceding decade. Most of the victims were young adults now, having aged out of the system, never knowing why they were constantly tired, why their medical records were mysteriously incomplete, or why they had small, recurring bruises. They learned that their bodies had been treated as a pharmacy, their cells sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, all while they were told they were too difficult to love. A class action lawsuit, led by the victims' new legal advocates, was launched against the 6 state DCF agencies for catastrophic systemic failure and negligence. The social workers, the ultimate betrayers, were exposed, and the foster care system itself was forced into a painful public examination of its internal vulnerabilities, how it had not only failed to protect, but had actively delivered children to their predators. For Sarah Garcia, the girl who fought back against the entire system, there was no simple happily ever after. She had survived, she had exposed the truth, and she had saved over a dozen children still in the crosshairs. But the horror she faced had a chillingly permanent quality. The investigation revealed the full, agonizing fate of the samples taken from her. The blood and tissue harvested from Sarah on that first terrifying night in March 2019 and in the months that followed had already been sold, shipped, and used. The ultimate buyers were traced to a wealthy, influential family in Singapore. Their daughter, critically ill, desperately needed a viable bone marrow transplant. They had paid $450,000 for a genetic match, and that match was Sarah Garcia. The medical procedure was a success. The daughter lived. Sarah's life had been stolen from, and in the most literal biological sense, it had been used to save a stranger. Sarah would spend the rest of her life knowing that a part of her, her cells, her DNA, the very essence of her biological self, was inside a wealthy stranger she would never meet. Her body, the only thing she truly owned, was commodified without her consent, treated not as a sanctuary, but as an inventory. This is the final kicker. The horror isn't the crime. It's the irrevocable permanence of the theft. The system meant to protect her had sold her piece by piece, and the transaction was final. Today, Sarah Garcia is a survivor advocate, but she lives with the ultimate, haunting knowledge that her sacrifice wasn't a choice. It was a robbery. She looks in the mirror and sees not just herself, but a stranger's lifeline. The story of the Thomases is a horrifying cautionary tale about the invisible victim society forgets. It's a reminder that exploitation doesn't always wear a mask of malice. Sometimes it wears a crisp white coat, a gentle smile, and has access to the highest levels of the institution sworn to protect the most vulnerable. What does it mean to be a human being when your very essence can be bought and sold by the people who promised you safety?